When Sauber signed Kimi Raikkonen to make his F1 debut in 2001, he'd only been out of karts for a year and had 23 car races and a Formula Renault UK title under his belt. It was a controversial signing and one that the FIA president tried and failed to block. On this episode of Bring Back V10s, we'll tell the inside story of Raikkonen's arrival to F1 with the help of someone who was there to witness it all from first-hand inside Sauber. But before we get to that, remember to get your questions in for our series finale, where you can ask us anything about F1 from 1989 to 2005, simply by using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter, or by leaving us a 5-star podcast review if you feel so inclined. Before we get to our guests today, we'll do a quick shout out to some of our latest reviewers. So thank you very much to 202 to Heathrow, AB Fitness 81, Richmond Tom, and Twitch 1089. We really appreciate all the reviews that are flying in at the moment, and I'll do my best over the remaining episodes of this series to catch up with the rest of them. But now let's get on to today's subject, and we'll start with our special guest, who should have an inside story or two for us from Raikkonen's first year in F1. So it's a very special welcome to the show to Raikkonen's engineer from that season, Jacky Eeckelaert. Jacky, thanks for coming along.
You're welcome.
Now, we always start these shows with the same first question, so I'll throw it to you first, which is quite simply, when you think back to Raikkonen's arrival in Formula One, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, of course, maybe I first can tell you how we came up with the idea of Kimi. I mean, it was actually in the year 2000. Sauber had two drivers, Mika Salo and Pedro Diniz. I think Pedro decided to quit F1. And Mika was offered a drive by Toyota, who entered F1. And okay, let's say the offer of Toyota was a bit too much to make a counter offer from the Sauber side. It was 3 times more than we paid him. So we are looking for another driver. Then my first idea was Jenson Button, because Jenson I followed from karting days already. I knew he was a bit special. And I knew he was doing his first year in 2000 with Williams, but I also knew that Frank had signed a contract to get Montoya in 2001 in F1. So Jenson was free for 2001. So that was my first idea. And so I told this to Peter. We contacted the Robertsons, father and son, who were managing Jenson. And they said, yeah, sorry, you're too late. We just signed a contract with Flavio Briatore to get Jenson at Renault. So then the Robertsons came up with Kimi Raikkonen, saying, Kimi. I said, do you know him? I said, well, I know him because I'm always informing myself with the professionals of the karting, to know who is better than the average. And I said, let's try Kimi. He said, yeah, but Kimi, I mean, but is his experience? He has done 6 or 7 races of Formula Renault. It was about mid-season 2000. But okay, fine. At the end, we decided with Peter to give him a test in Mugello in the year 2000. And the first day he was testing a Formula One car, I think 12 months before he was still a car driver, So it was really a big jump and a very quick move. But I was impressed from day one, let's say. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We'll come to it shortly, the impact of that Mugello test, but also how Sauber maybe kept some of it quiet. But also joining us is Mark Hughes, a man who's covered Raikkonen's entire F1 career, which remarkably is still going on today. So Mark, when you think back to Kimi in 2001, what's the first thing that stands out for you?
I remember watching him in practice at Imola, which was round 4. And it wasn't just how instant his adaptation to Formula One was, it was how spectacular it was, because he wasn't just not overawed by the car, he was on top of it and hustling it very aggressively. He was, in those days, he was all curbs and catch, unlike the smoother Kimi of later years. But he made virtually no errors. He just didn't look like a rookie. And I remember standing in a cold practice session at Acqua Minerale, and his confidence and car control were just extraordinary. And he was visually the most exciting guy of all to watch and at that time. And on race day, before his steering wheel came adrift and caused him to crash, he'd been snapping at the heels of Barrichello's Ferrari, a much faster car. And I thought back to that 17 years later in Baku, as another young Sauber rookie, Charles Leclerc, was hassling the Ferrari ahead of him, driven by Raikkonen. So it was a nice circle of time.
Yeah, and I think we'd agree that Charles Leclerc's probably got quite a good F1 career ahead of him. So we will start Raikkonen's journey into F1 at the 2000 Hungarian Grand Prix, because that's where one of his managers, Dave Robertson, worked his magic on Peter Sauber to convince him to get this F1 test that Jacky mentioned earlier. Sauber has said in the years since that he's not sure why he agreed to give a test to someone who was less than a year out of karting. But in a feature on the official F1 website, written by a former colleague of mine, Lawrence Barretto, and titled The Inside Story of Kimi Raikkonen's legendary first F1 test, Sauber said Robertson must have infected me with his enthusiasm. He added, "I'm still surprised that I agreed to this test because a 3-day test is very expensive." In that same feature, Steve Robertson, Dave's son, said that a big part of the pitch was that if Sauber didn't take Kimi, the Robertsons would find him a seat elsewhere, and that did work on Sauber. Basically, the threat, I think, in their words, was he will get swallowed up by a big team. So, Jacky, you mentioned there how Raikkonen came onto your radar. Before he drove the car, though, did you have any reservations about a guy going straight from Formula Renault into an F1 car with Sauber?
Actually, not too much, because, as I said to you before, I'm always trying to get to know the drivers through the karting professionals, because they learn to know the drivers when they're still very young, 12, 14, 15 years old, 16 years old. There is no manager, there is no lawyer, there is nothing like that, around. So, and they know a kid is much more transparent than an adult. And they know not only if they're fast, everybody knows it because you see the lap times, but they also know the character. When something goes wrong, does he give up or does he goes on, They know how strong their character is, their will to win, which is very important, of course. And from Kimi, and you also through these karting professionals, he was something quite special, a bit like also Jensen was quite special, and others like Kubica, others the names they gave to me. And so basically, I think if you used to race in very high level karting, like the Formula A in those days was the top level of karting, and you're very good, I mean, you got the potential to drive an F1 car. And the only thing you have to work for sure is the physical condition, because a karting race is 20 minutes and a F1 race is 1.5 hours, and it's not 1.5 or 2 Gs, is like 4 to 5 Gs. So for sure, that's something you have to work on, but the potential is there and the character is there to succeed. So actually, I was quite convinced.
What about you, Mark? How was your knowledge of the early 2000s karting scene? When you heard before the test that Sauber was giving this guy a run, did it register much in the paddock and around the media centres around the world, do you think? Or was it just an unheard of name, really, getting a chance?
To be honest, it didn't register that strongly, really. I don't think it was generally realised what an extensive, exhaustive test this was going to be. We knew the Robertsons were very savvy operators, and they'd just brought Jensen into F1 the year before, and we assumed Dave had just done one of his sales pitches on Peter. It wasn't unusual for small teams to be trying out new drivers at the time when there weren't restrictions on test days. So it's not as big a formal deal as it would be now, or actually as this one turned out to be. It put Raikkonen's name on the F1 radar, but it seemed a couple of years away at least before he'd be a legitimate F1 prospect, even to those of us who had at least heard of him and were aware of what he was doing, John Booth's team in Formula Renault.
Yeah, and the test took place in the middle of September 2000 at Mugello, as we mentioned. Raikkonen did 28 laps on the first day, 4 seconds off the pace set by Olivier Panis for McLaren, and perhaps more relevantly, 2.4 seconds slower than Sauber's current driver, Diniz. Diniz was only there for the first day, so Raikkonen was left with only Panis and Michael Schumacher for company on track for the next 2 days. And on the second day, he went half a second quicker than Diniz had managed, and just over 2 seconds down on Panis. And on the third day, he was 3 seconds slower than the McLaren. Now, in the F1 article that we mentioned earlier, Sauber technical director Willy Ramps mentioned that as well as not crashing the car, one of the key moments that impressed the team was when they took the fuel out for a qualifying run. They didn't tell Raikkonen what his target lap time should be, but they knew the lighter fuel load should be worth 1.2 seconds, and that's how much faster he went on that run. Now, Jacky, not only were you Kimi's engineer in 2001, but you ran the car at this test. How impressed were you with what you saw? And is it true that Michael Schumacher came along for a chat after he'd seen Raikkonen on track?
Yeah, exactly. That's true. Well, let's say the first day, because I knew his neck was not up to driving an F1 car, especially in Mugello, because Mugello, with high speed cars, especially the double right-hander Arrabbiata, is ringing off your head. Yeah, I mean, so I told him the first day we'll do only a limited number of runs from maximum 3 time laps, just to give your neck the possibility to catch up again. And in the meantime, we'll check the data and so on. And because also you have to learn all that, of course, because I mean, he has driven karting, which is completely different in terms of setup of an F1 car. Then he has driven this bit of Formula 4 in the wind and Formula Renault. But of course, in terms of setup, I mean, it has nothing to do with an F1 car. And what impressed me at the beginning, because he was a rookie, I told him first, get used to the power of the car, accelerating in a straight line without wheel spinning too much. Get used to the brakes, because brakes in Formula 1 is massive, because the drag of the carbon brakes in the downforce. Second, then we concentrate on the corners more and more and more. And so I set up the car quite understeery, because it's of course more safe. It's not the quickest way, but it's much more safe than a more, let's say, balanced car. And already after the second outing, he said to me, he asked me, can you not get a bit of less understeer in the car, because I don't like this too much. It makes me slower. So, and the way he progressed during the day, there was for him no hurry. He had nothing to prove immediately. He only wants to learn. He's like he wants to take up everything. He could, even during the runs on the first day, because sometimes between one and the second run we waited like 3/4 of an hour after giving him a massage on his neck and so on. And then he wanted to climb up the hill and going to watch Michael Schumacher taking the corners in his Ferrari, at the side of the track. And as a matter of fact, in the evening, and we're still after the debriefing, we were still preparing the run plan for the second day. Somebody knocked at the door of the motorhome, and I opened the door. It was Michael, and he said to me, "Who is this guy you're running today?" And I said, "Yeah, Kimi Raikkonen. He's 12 months ago. He was still karting and so on." And I saw in his eyes, "What do you want to tell me?" And he told me he will go very, very, very fast. He's a quick guy. So I was convinced.
No. Well, he was definitely right. So, yeah, Michael's eye for talent certainly wasn't off that day. What I found fascinating going back and looking over the coverage of this test at the time was how low-key everything was afterwards. All we got from Peter Sauber was that Raikkonen adapted blindingly quickly to an F1 car. And other than that, he just said, we will have to consider very carefully whether we will work with him or not. But even at that point, he was being speculated that it would be for a test driver role. And Raikkonen said he expected to race in F3 in 2001. But he did say, if I had the chance to do something in F1, then I would do it straight away, because you can learn a lot. So, Mark, as we mentioned earlier, we know now how pivotal Kimi's performance was at this test. But thinking back to at the time, did many whispers get out about that he'd done something this special?
No. We later heard about that Michael Schumacher had been very intrigued to see how hard the car was being pushed and wanted to know who was in it, Jacky's story. So that kind of pricked up our ears a bit, but there were no times available. It was all done a private test, a long way from the other teams. It was all within the Ferrari family sort of thing. But with the Robertsons, you never knew. Dave would be telling us that this kid was fantastic and that he was even better than Jensen. We could see from Formula Renault he did look good. But it might all have been just Dave hyping up his client. So there's no obvious certainty about any of it. He'd done the test. He'd done a good job. He'd interested Michael Schumacher. So he's now definitely on the radar. But it was no more than that.
And Jacky, was it deliberate from Sauber to downplay the test and not talk about it too much in public?
Yeah, maybe yes, because I think at the beginning, Peter could not imagine signing a Formula 1 race driver that 12 months before was still a karting driver. He was a bit very unusual, and I must admit it was. But I was convinced, so instead of trying to sign him up as a test driver, I want to sign him up as a race driver. And we had a lot of discussions about that. And at the end, Peter had the balls to do this, because you need balls to do that for sure. I mean, but I think also the Robertsons, Dave for sure is a very good salesman. Steve also, but Steve, he had been quite a decent Formula 3 driver, I think, in the UK. And he had a good eye for fast drivers, a very good eye to find the good drivers. That's for sure. He was just not marketing talking. He was also the truth behind it, But the proof it is that both of those drivers, Jenson and Kimi, became world champion. So
yeah, they did okay.
yeah.
There was another test a couple of weeks later back at Mugello, and this time Raikkonen was joined in the Sauber by Enrique Bernoldi, who was the team's official test driver and backed by its main sponsor and team shareholder, Red Bull. Raikkonen was quicker than Bernoldi by half a tenth, although Bernoldi said he set his best time when the track was a lot hotter and therefore slower than it was for Raikkonen. Jacky, from a distance, this looks a lot like a shootout between Red Bull's preferred driver and Sauber's choice. Was that the case?
Actually, it was the case, yeah, because after Kimi's first test, Peter spoke to Dietrich Mateschitz about Kimi, and because Dietrich knew we needed a new driver to replace Mika Salo, and because Dinis was already replaced by Nick Heidfeld, he was signed already. He knew that Enrique Bernoldi, who had done, I think, already 2 seasons of Formula 3000 with the team of Dr. Marco, fully sponsored by Red Bull. The logical choice would be that he would go to F1 with the Sauber team, which was sponsored and co-owned by Red Bull. So that's why we had to do this compare, because I was pushing for Kimi and Mateschitz was pushing for, and especially Marco was pushing for Bernoldi. And so we had to give them a common test, and based on the results of that test, we would decide which of them would take the Formula 1 drive. And I mean, for sure, Bernoldi was also very, very fast. No problem with his speed at all. But apart from giving them, let's say, shiny tires and low fuel to test their pure speed on one lap, I also let them do long runs of 20 laps with the right amount of fuel to see their consistency over the long run. And there the picture was very clear. I mean, when the tire's getting old and the car gets difficult to drive, Bernoldi was no match for Kimi at those days.
And that's amazing considering Raikkonen's lack of experience. And it was a month after this test, so by the end of October, that the talk of Raikkonen possibly getting an F1 test deal had turned into a likely race deal for 2001. Nothing was signed at this point, but Peter Sauber was clearly quite confident, because he said, there are several aspects why we very strongly believe that Raikkonen is the right man for us. First of all, his very professional approach towards his work and his astonishing maturity considering his age. Even more impressive is his natural speed. He seems to crank out fast lap times effortlessly. In comparison with other drivers, we never got the impression that he reached his limits. We still have to find out how fast he can go. Raikkonen said it was a great opportunity, and he even said, I found driving the F1 car was quite easy, much easier than getting back into a Formula Renault afterwards. At the time, Steve Robertson said, we've been told it's an internal decision and they'll tell us when it's been made. We know there are people within the team pulling for Kimi. And I think we've got one of those people on the chat with us today. But before we bring Jacky back in, Mark, when you first started to get word that actually Sauber were looking at giving this guy a race seat for 2001, were you surprised, or by this point, did you know how well he'd done in the tests?
It was still a surprise. The word had started leaking out a bit more about how impressive the tests were, but it was still a surprise. It was unprecedented for someone's second season of car racing to be in F1. There'd been rapid ascents before, but none this rapid. But talking to John Booth about it later, who ran him in Formula Renault, he made the point that the 21-year-old Raikkonen he got in his Formula Renault team was already largely fully formed, and he reckoned it was because he'd stayed in karts until he was 20, which was even then was pretty late, simply because he'd not had the budget to move out of it. So he was able to keep developing himself in that crucial age between, say, 16 and your early 20s, when everyone makes so much progress, personal progress. By contrast, a couple of years later, John got a 17-year-old Lewis Hamilton for his Formula Renault team, who, while just as talented, was not at that stage anything like as the fully formed item. He still had a load of development to do, so, but not Kimi. So Kimi dominated that Formula Renault season. He was virtually unbeaten that year. Formula Renault car was already like child's play to him. He was at its limits within a few minutes of getting into it and fully in control of his environment. It was similar in a way to what we'd seen with Ayrton Senna when he arrived in Britain to do Formula Ford in 81. He'd already done his development and evolution in Brazilian karting, where he'd spent many years away from the spotlight, just getting better and better. So what we saw turning up in the UK was the fully formed and fully polished final product, and he looked instantly sensational. Whereas you're watching the British guys develop in front of you, so it didn't look quite so impressive. So, yeah, I think we saw a similar thing with Kimi. He was already very fully formed when he arrived in car racing.
And as November dragged on, Sauber made it clear it wanted Raikkonen as a race driver for 2001, but then rumours started to emerge from the FIA that the governing body wasn't keen on giving Raikkonen a super licence. Raikkonen was named as a Sauber driver on the official F1 entry list at the start of December, but his fate would be decided at a meeting of the F1 Commission on December the 7th, at the end of a week where Raikkonen would effectively be supervised in testing at Jerez. Raikkonen was pretty dismissive of the speculation about if he was ready to race in F1. Before that test, he said everybody should be given an equal opportunity. I'm not sure how they can judge who can have a super licence. I only hope to be given a chance. I may have only done 23 car races, but I don't believe the number is a key issue. I don't think Sauber would want a driver who's not ready for F1. I could do a season in something else, but I cannot see that changing my way of driving. So, Jacky, ahead of that Jerez test, was there much concern at Sauber about the fact that Kimi was being supervised, or was everyone pretty relaxed and confident that Kimi would pass whatever this test was supposed to be?
Well, based on what we saw in doing in the two Mugello tests, we were pretty convinced that there would be no problem at all. For sure, the FIA at the end gave him a license only for the first 4 races, so he was a bit on probation, let's say. But no, we were quite confident because, as you said, he's a very quick learner. He was already much more mature than he should have been, let's say, in F1. If you see his small number of laps, his short experience, but he was very mature and he made no mistakes. And that was the main thing also for the FIA, to not send out a driver in Formula One who could be a danger for the others, But there was no problem with that. We're pretty convinced it was okay.
And unsurprisingly, Raikkonen performed just fine in that test. He was always in the top half of the times in a field of 16 or 17 drivers from day to day, and never too far away from Sauber's other new driver, Nick Heidfeld, in the order. Sure enough, the F1 Commission then voted in favour by 24 votes to 1 to give Raikkonen a super licence, and we'll come back to that one vote against in a moment. Peter Sauber said Kimi was able to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the FIA the qualities that attracted us in the first place. It was clear from the outset that the step into Formula One was not too big for him. That put Raikkonen on a Sauber deal worth $500,000 plus another $50,000 per point. Raikkonen's reaction was this. He said, "This is the right decision because there were no rules that said you cannot come into Formula One after only racing below Formula 3. I don't want to have a big crash or do anything stupid. Of course, I'm still going to be nervous on the grid in Melbourne, but now I will be doing everything I can in 2001 to justify the faith that Sauber and the governing body have placed in me." Mark, at this point, we've obviously seen Raikkonen have to perform somewhat in the spotlight at this Jerez test. All the other teams were there. We know the focus was on him. Given how that test went, even to an outsider, did it seem straightforward that he would get his licence approved after that?
Yeah, it did. He'd proved to be on the pace. He wasn't having accidents. It would have been faintly ridiculous and kind of frustrating if he'd not been allowed to take up the offer of the drive. So it ended up being a provisional granting, didn't it? And that was a pretty good compromise because there wasn't much doubt that he'd proved worthy of his place in F1 during that provisional period.
Now, I did say I would mention the one vote against Raikkonen. That was cast by none other than FIA President Max Mosley. Mosley explained his position, saying, "Unfortunately, the F1 Commission doesn't always do as I tell them, despite speculation to the contrary. I do not believe that they adopted a defensible position in giving an inexperienced driver like Raikkonen a licence. it's quite wrong that we have strict criteria for graduation into F1 when there is a major accident caused by the presence of a very inexperienced driver. I'm the one who will have to explain it to the world's media. Jacky, can you understand why Max took that position?
Well, a little bit, yes. I think he wants to cover his ass, let's say. No, a little bit. Because for sure, I mean, he did not know exactly what we knew about Kimi. And there is always a risk. Even if did a very good job, he could be involved in whatever accident. And if you have bad luck, a wheel's coming off and killing a marshal or whatever, and it would be him, his car, for sure, people will point the finger at the president of the FIA, which was Max. So I understand a little bit his concern. And he knew also after the meeting that he was the only one probably who said no. So there was no influence. And he covered himself a little bit, I think. Yeah.
What did you think, Mark? You mentioned that the compromise that we came to seemed to be pretty fair in the end. Do you think Max was, as Jacky said there, was Max just sort of covering his own position by knowing that the vote was going to go against him anyway?
Yeah, I think so. I think the legal book would have stopped with him if Kimi had proven a liability and caused any injurious accidents, let's say, because it was granted against the FIA's own regulations. But I think it was now becoming evident, and Kimi turned out to be the proof of this, that in terms of driving difficulty, F1 wasn't as big a jump from the junior categories as it had been. The cars were a lot more sanitary, let's say, than earlier F1 cars, that you didn't have to go through the taming of the monster first and have your expensive accidents before you could start to exploit the car. Jenson Button had come in and done an immaculate season the year before, straight from one season of F3, though he'd done Formula Ford before that. But it was becoming evident that the really gifted guys from the junior categories could jump straight in, as Jacky said, and begin to fully stretch an F1 car very quickly. And so in that sense, maybe the regulation requirement hadn't fully caught up yet. You watch in-car footage from the 80s and in-car Senna, say, and you can see that those cars were monsters, very physical, animalistic almost, to steer and kick back, the lack of sophistication in the behavior. But by the time of the early 2000s, the cars were becoming much more refined and the control systems were better. They had more instrumentation and sensors, so the engineers could finesse them better. It was easier to exploit their assets without having first to get accustomed to their vices and having accidents doing so, which is how it used to be. I mean, rookies always had accidents. It was accepted, but it was no longer the case. But you could see Max's point. Yeah, and also it set a precedent for the less gifted or able drivers who might have had the required backing, but not have been up to it, might have been able to use that loophole in future to shortcut their way to F1. But Kimi was there totally on merit. He already looked outstanding.
Regardless of Raikkonen's readiness for F1, and as we would see in 2001, there really wasn't any reason to worry, the decision sparked all kinds of reaction from drivers already on the grid. Ralf Schumacher said he had nothing against Raikkonen, but he believed drivers should have to do at least 1 year of F3 and maybe a season of F3000 before stepping up, because in Ralph's words, those are the schools for F1 and that's where you learn your job. Button said that Raikkonen was clearly quick enough but needed more experience of racing. Jensen said F3 is one of the best training grounds there is, and he felt that Raikkonen hadn't had the competition in Formula Renault because he'd had the best car and not really had to race anyone. He also warned Kimi that based on his own experience, he would find that when you get to Australia for the first race, the race drivers step up another gear compared to what they do in testing. Ferrari's Rubens Barrichello added that the FIA should ask the existing drivers before handing out a licence. And he said, I'm sure Raikkonen will make mistakes this year. I made mine in F3 and F3000. Raikkonen is a talented driver, but I'm sure he has not learned everything about driving a racing car in just 23 races. To counter all of that, Steve Robertson said, I believe that Kimi is a special case and he is ready for F1 right now, but that doesn't make F3 or F3000 any less relevant for the majority of drivers. Jacky, presumably, based on what you'd seen already by this point, I imagine you didn't share any of those concerns that these guys were raising.
Absolutely not. No, for me, I mean, we've seen in the past, not similar things to Kimi, but let's say, okay, Alain Prost, he went straight from Formula 3 to Formula 1. Nelson Piquet went straight from Formula 3 to Formula 1. Ayrton Senna went straight from Formula 3 to Formula 1. Okay, So I mean, it's possible, I think, for the very high talented drivers to go straight to Formula One. And as you mentioned also before, I mean, staying a few years longer in karting, I mean, racing is something you learn in karting for sure. And high level karting for me is a higher level of driving and racing than is Formula 4, for instance. Because now all the kids, when they're 14 years old, they want to go to Formula 4 and racing cars instead of karts. But I'm not too sure if it's a good move to do, honestly. I think a high level karting championship, the level of driving is extremely high. And the driving is very close. So if you do this a few years more, I think you're at least much better prepared to drive in cars than going too quick to F4, I think. That's my opinion. Of course, Formula 4 team owners will not agree with that, but I mean, just a personal opinion.
Yeah. The debate around Raikkonen continued into January 2001. Kimi said that while he'd only done 23 car races, as Jacky said there, he had been racing in karts for 13 years, so he felt he knew what he was doing. Michael Schumacher went public around this time with his opinion, saying that from what he observed at Mugello, he could see Raikkonen had the potential to be a champion. Steve Robertson also pointed out that no one really minded when Jarno Trulli stepped up to F3 from F3 to F1 in 1997, and he said he felt that was a similar step up in power to Formula Renault to F1 in 2001. Trulli backed that up, saying he was probably less prepared than Button and Raikkonen, and he added, nobody in Formula One has the right to stand in their way. Mark, looking at the talk about the junior ladder, was there any validity to the concerns that this could damage those well-known steps of things like F3 and F3000, or was this just an earlier episode of what we went through in 2014 when we learned Max Verstappen was getting an F1 drive after 1 year of car racing?
Yeah, exactly. There was no threat to the junior categories. It wasn't as if the whole F3 field was suddenly going to be an F1. It was only going to be the drop jaw exceptions who looked irresistible. There was still going to be a healthy demand for the lower categories, as F1 wouldn't have been looking to give them all drives. So no, I don't think that was a valid concern.
Sauber launched its car and confirmed Jacky as Raikkonen's engineer at the end of January. Peter Sauber was asked about the new lineup of Heidfeld and Raikkonen, with just 1 year of F1 experience between them. Peter said Raikkonen was impossible to overlook for the second seat, adding, "We know that it will take Kimi time to find his feet in F1 once the racing starts, but our expectations of his long-term potential are very high. We are taking a risk, but it is a controlled risk. When I see how cool Kimi is approaching Formula One racing, I do not think there is a danger." He also explained that Sauber was betting on youth because he felt the established names were out of reach. He said, "To move forward, we need drivers of the calibre of Trulli, Barrichello or Frentzen, but we can never get these sorts of drivers, so that is why we have to take on very young talent and build them ourselves." Later in the year, he did mention that story Jacky told us earlier about trying to get Jenson Button for 2001. But Peter then said, "I discovered there was a young driver who was more promising than Button, Kimi Raikkonen." He also told a great story about Mika Salo, who had just left the team. When the team did their first test with Heidfeld and Raikkonen, Salo called him up and asked what the team had done to the cars to make them so quick. And Peter responded, "Mika, we've got new drivers." Jacky, how refreshing was it for Sauber to go into a season with two young drivers who were so highly rated? Or would you have preferred to have maybe one of those young guns and then someone like Trulli, Frentzen or Barrichello alongside?
Well, actually, no. For me, it was okay like this. I think it's something that a team like Sauber could afford to risk. Not a team like Ferrari or McLaren in those days, because they need an established driver for sure. But I think what Peter Sauber decided to do, for sure, it was a risk, but it was a very calculated risk. At least he had Nick Heidfeld, who had done already one season, and who had a proven record, let's say. So we could count on him as the regular point scorer, and Kimi was the one who will the coming up talent, let's say. And honestly, all of us, Peter and myself and all of the engineers, were looking forward to start the season with these two new young drivers. We knew we would make fun with both of them. The car was pretty good. The drivers were motivated. Everybody was motivated. So it was actually a very nice season. One of my finest years of F1, I must say.
Yeah, I think it worked out okay. At the launch, Peter Sauber raised another interesting little issue around this time, calling for F1 to change its points system. This was still in the era when points were only paid to the top 6 finishers, and Sauber had worked out that if F1 had a system like kart in America, which rewarded the top 12 finishers, then Sauber would have been 6th in the constructors' standings instead of 8th, jumping ahead of Arrows and Jordan. Sauber said that result would have been a fairer reflection, but he claimed the FIA would never change it because they want to compare the points to the past, to people like Fangio. Mark, was this just a case of Sauber spotting that a different point system would reflect well on his team, or did you think that by the turn of the century we were already reaching that point where reliability was improving, so it was time to consider spreading the points out a bit to give the smaller teams something to race for?
I guess so, yes. I mean, I can't speak for Peter, obviously, but given how vital the team payments were to the survival of the smaller teams and how they directly correlated with the points that you score, it seemed a very restrictive that points only went to the top 6. So with the improved reliability, that's potentially just 3 teams if they've got everything sorted. So with a few random small crumbs of opportunity, if you happen to be the little team that was around to pick up the pieces, then you get a point or two. But it wasn't really in your hands. So broadening the point system out at least would make it more merit-based. It would distinguish between finishing 7th and 10th on how consistent you were. So, yeah, I think the argument had merit regardless of what the motivation of bringing it up was.
Yeah, imagine how bad it would be today if only the top 6 were scoring points with the way the field's strung out. Jacky, were you aware of this feeling within Sauber at the time, and was this an idea you would have supported?
Yeah, for sure. It was an idea that I supported already in those days, because I think if, let's say, if you have 0 points at the end of the year and you finish, let's say, 10 times 7th or 8th or 9th or whatever, and you still got 0 points. I mean, 0 is 0, you know. So to sell your team to a sponsor if you have 0 points is not good. I prefer, let's say, to be, let's say, on 12 teams, to be 9th in the championship with 20 points than to be 9th in the championship with 0 points. You know what I mean? It's more valuable, you know. So I think it was a good thing to do this, because 0 is really, nobody likes to be a 0, you know. And it was very hard to get into the points in those days. Very hard. The first 6, especially in those days where normally the first 6 are always Ferrari and McLaren already, who were in the neighborhood. So was only a few spots left for the other teams.
Yeah, and it was shortly after this Sauber launch that we got public confirmation of Raikkonen starting the season on probation with the FIA. Max Mosley explained this in an interview with the Australian Grand Prix organisers ahead of the first race. He said, probably our super licence system is in need of an overhaul because there are very clear rules about how you get a super licence. You have to have won a Formula 3 championship or to have had certain success in Formula 3000. It's all very clear, and it seemed to me that if you have criteria, you should follow them. He said that there was a rule, an exceptions rule, which was how they got Raikkonen in, but that was actually intended for when older drivers came back after time away from F1 rather than to let a complete rookie in. He explained that Raikkonen would be on probation for the first 3 or 4 races, and he added, having said all that, I think he will do a very good job, and I'm confident he'll be quite safe and probably very successful. Jacky, was there much reaction inside Sauber to the news of Kimi being on probation? And did the FIA make it clear in any way what he had to do to pass probation?
We knew it was a bit of a risk, of course, but knowing Kimi, and we explained him quite well what the situation was, we were pretty sure he would not do any stupid things. And we also made him clear, say, the first 4 races, you cannot take any risk in racing somebody and taking him off or something like that. That is very clear. After that, it will be okay. But let's be extra careful on the first 4 races because Kimi is a racer. It's difficult to overtake, and if you try to block somebody, sometimes you touch each other, and so we told him for the first 4 races, do not take any risk, just start doing your thing. You drive your pace, you finish your race, and that's it.
Mark, do you think this was Max maybe trying to reclaim some ground after he'd lost or he had been outvoted?
No, I think I follow his logic about the regulations needing to be changed to reflect the new reality, which we touched on earlier. I think it was just becoming evident that the really outstanding guys could instantly be on the pace in Formula One because of the how much more sanitary the cars had become.
Raikkonen dispelled any doubts immediately on his F1 debut. He qualified 13th, but was disappointed not to be in the top 10 and finished 7th on the road, which became 6th and therefore a debut point when Sauber successfully appealed against Olivier Panis for overtaking Heidfeld under yellow flags, getting Panis a 25-second penalty. Peter Sauber called the performance a miracle and better than we dared hope for. Raikkonen also earned praise from Alain Prost, who at this stage was still a team boss in F1. Prost said, "You can see he deserves his place. There are not many drivers around today who are out of the ordinary." Jacky, did Kimi exceed your expectations on his debut weekend, or had you seen enough in testing to know that this is what he was capable of?
Well, I knew what he was capable of, and for sure he was still in a learning process. Testing is one thing, performing as a race driver in Grand Prix is another story, of course. And basically, what I told Kimi before the race also is you have to push always, even if you're not in the points, you push maximum until the last flag, until the flag, checkered flag, always. Because in those days, there was no limitation of number of engines or gearboxes or whatever. So it was very important for a team when that the driver is pushing 100% until the end of the race. Because if you push only 95%, suddenly the car becomes very reliable, for sure. It's the last 5% that makes things break on the car. And for us, it was very important that if the car would break down, or if after the race we take it apart and we see something was very close to break down, it's better to have this when you're not in the points than you are in the points. So in terms of making the car more reliable, re-engineering some parts of the car, it was extremely important. The driver pushes really hard until the end. So that's what he did. And luckily, because he was not in the points, but he pushed extremely hard until the end of the race. And I think he was something like, can't remember exactly, 12 seconds behind Panis, who finished 6th. And then Panis got his 20 or 25-second penalty, and that's why he became 6th and got his first point. If he would not have pushed, he would have been a little bit laid back, let's say, in the last 15 laps of the race. Maybe he would not have got that point, So I was quite impressed with that. And after this decision from the stewards, so that Kimi was classified 6th and got his first point in his first race ever in F1, I asked him, so Kimi, what do you think? First race, first point? And then he looked at me with his blue eyes and he said, another 5 to beat. That's all he said.
Mark, you've covered many an F1 debut by now. How good was this one from Raikkonen?
Oh, it was outstanding, but it was no more than looked possible from his test performances, really, and from his qualifying, and he qualified well and held his position and was very consistent. The noteworthy thing is that he could so easily have been tripped up at a circuit like Albert Park, which can be pretty punishing of a small mistake, but he was good enough to have all that mapped out in his head where the hazard points were. The act of driving a car quickly doesn't take up much of his mental capacity, so he had plenty of time to calmly assess those hazards, I'm sure, not taking too much curb at the turn 9 chicane because there's not much track space left in which to recover before you hit the wall, that type of thing, just all the little details that might trip you up. I'm sure he was onto them pretty quickly. So yeah, it was an outstanding debut, but it wasn't even that surprising that he was already looking quite exceptional.
Kimi retired from the next 3 races, but it's the third of these I want to briefly stop off at, partly because it was a strange reason to retire from the San Marino Grand Prix, and partly because it happened right in front of me as I was sat on the banks at Tosa. Raikkonen accelerated out of the tight left-hander and he began blasting past the Tifosi and me with my Jacques Villeneuve Canadian flag, and then the car snapped to the left and straight into the wall. It was a strange looking crash, and with good reason, because the steering wheel came off in Kimi's hands. Raikkonen said afterwards it was incredible, and he said he even tried to reattach the wheel before the car lost control, which seems quite ambitious. Jacky, Kimi was certain that he put the wheel on correctly before the race. Did you ever get to the bottom of what happened at Imola?
Yes, for sure. I mean, it was 100% a mistake from us, from the team. So we had redesigned some parts, because there was a problem with the fixation. It was a bit too sticky, and some things had been redesigned. And I think it was a problem with tolerances of new machine parts, that it could come off by pulling on it, And of course, it was a team mistake. It's nothing to do with Kimi. So basically, we were lucky that it only was an accident like that without any physical damage, let's say, to the driver. And you could clearly see in the data, like you said, that he's trying to putting the steering wheel back on, because on the steering wheel already in those days, we had a lot of switches and rotaries for setting up a lot of stuff on the car. And all these switches are connected with a multi-pin connector that goes through the steering column. So each time the steering wheel came off, all those data on the telemetry, they dropped to zero. Now, when you put it back on, they came up again, then they dropped again. So you saw he was trying to push the steering wheel back on in the data. And what was very impressive, that while he's doing this, his throttle sensor showed he was flooring the throttle in fourth gear into the ref limiter all the time. So he was doing like 240 kilometers per hour while trying to pushing the steering wheel on. I was quite impressed, I must say. But yeah, it was a team mistake. So.
Certainly fearless. This weekend was the first time that Raikkonen out-qualified Heidfeld, and he said that 4 races into his F1 career, he was starting to feel a lot more comfortable. He said, I have more confidence. At the beginning, I was unsure what it was going to be like in Formula 1. Now I know. There are no surprises. You learn something every time you go out in the car, and you go quicker every time. His countryman Mika Häkkinen was impressed as well, saying Kimi has already shown enough potential to say that he's going to be a Grand Prix winner. So Mark, you mentioned earlier that anecdote about watching Kimi at Imola. From what we'd seen over the body of the first 4 races, was it already clear that regardless of the probation, Raikkonen belonged in F1 by this point?
Oh yeah, I think that was clear after Melbourne. Really, it was more just how far can this guy go, because he was clearly exceptional. It was more, will he get the opportunity of getting in a top car and when. Because yes, he was not just worthy of his place in F1. He was he's clearly one of the star performers of F1 already.
We'll move on a couple of races and get to the Austrian Grand Prix, because Raikkonen got a real statement result here, finishing 4th and in the process taking Sauber past 100 points in F1. Raikkonen said it felt like a long wait from Australia to score points again, and at the time this put him level in the championship with Häkkinen, which was quite a big talking point in Finland. BAR lodged a protest against Raikkonen for overtaking Luciano Berti's Prost under yellow flags, perhaps looking for some revenge for that Australia protest, but the FIA threw it out. Jacky, this was Kimi's best result in F1 up to this point. How impressed were you with this drive to 4th in Austria? And how much had Kimi improved from the start of the season to this point, just a few more races in?
Well, actually, I was impressed, but I expected it a little bit, And I've seen through the season from Melbourne onwards that he was progressing all the time. Like he said himself, more and more confident. And especially, so he had to learn, of course, to extract the maximum of the car on new tires and low fuel in qualified is one thing. But especially, he became more and more stronger during the race, because, say, in those days, a classical race was 3 times 20 laps, each time with new tires. So, and on these long runs of 20, 25 laps, he was learning a lot. His average pace was always improving a lot. So he learned to manage the tires, to get the maximum out of the tires over 20 laps, and not just 2-3 laps very fast and then dropping down. And that impressed me quite a lot. And that, of course, improved his race pace quite a lot. And it's all about race pace at the end. So finishing fourth in Austria was quite impressive, but I expected it to happen sooner or later.
Yeah, Heidfeld has said recently, actually, that he was amazed at how good Kimi was in race trim from the very beginning. There was another fourth place a couple of races later in Canada, but the real story from the Canadian Grand Prix weekend was that this was when McLaren made first contact with Raikkonen. Hakkinen helped to make this meeting happen, and by this stage, he was already thinking of retiring, and he told Ron Dennis that. Hakkinen then flew back to the UK with Raikkonen for a Silverstone test, and they talked about the McLaren opportunity some more. There were also rumours coming out of Italy that Ferrari was interested in Raikkonen, and Peter Sauber addressed that speculation in August. Peter said, if Ferrari want Kimi Raikkonen, they can have him if they give us 3 engines. We are going to keep both Kimi and Nick next year, and we have every intention of keeping them as long as possible to build on the success of this year. It was a risk bringing them here to many people, but not to me. We have Kimi under contract for 3 years. I don't want to make money on him. I want him to race for me. Now, Jacky, by this point in the season, with the rumours of McLaren and Ferrari being interested, were you becoming worried at all that you might only get to spend 1 year working with Kimi?
Yes and no. Let's say, of course, I think it became obvious to a lot of people in the paddock that Kimi was an exceptional talent. And I knew already very early, also from the Robertsons, that he could eventually go to McLaren because Mieke was thinking about retiring. And for sure, I mean, he was a bit of a shame. On the other hand, the Robertsons told me he wants you to come with him to McLaren as race engineer. So eventually, I could have gone on working with Kimi at McLaren. At the end, I didn't because I gave my word to Peter to stay another year with him. And but at the end, I stayed another 4 years with him. And for Swiss people, a word is more worth than a contract. So at the end, I didn't do it. But I think on the other hand, I was also happy because, I mean, in those days, McLaren Mercedes car was really a top team. And I think Kimi deserved to drive for a top team for sure. Okay, our team Sauber was also not bad, but it was more like a midfield team. It was maybe one of the best because we finished in 2001 fourth in the Constructors' Championship. Bearing in mind there were people like constructors like Ferrari, Jaguar, Renault, Toyota, all those works teams. We all beat them. Not Ferrari, but the others we beat them. And so he was very good. But I understand Kimi, you know, he knew the McLaren Mercedes was a faster car than the Sauber Ferrari or the Sauber Petronas Ferrari. Of course, a driver who is eager to win, especially with the ambition of Kimi Raikkonen, he prefers to drive the McLaren, so don't stop him. We could eventually, or Peter could, because we had a 3-year contract with him. But I think he was more intelligent to use this extra 2-year contract for the financial situation of the team to help financial result.
And Mark, was the buzz and interest around Raikkonen by the summer of 2001 always going to be too much for Sauber to resist?
I think you can't really force a driver, even if you got him under contract. You can't really force him to stay there if it was going to be against his will. And if somebody's waving a top team contract in front of a driver, of course he's going to want to take it. He's got his own ambition to think of. So yeah, I think given that McLaren were prepared to pay what they were prepared to pay, and then that was valuable investment in the team when it was really needed. Yeah, it was pretty much a done deal that's what was going to happen.
Yeah, and Sauber built their wind tunnel out of it. I think they still call it the Kimi wind tunnel. But there was another interesting story around Sauber at this time, because Peter Sauber revealed that Red Bull had finally told him he made the right decision in taking Raikkonen over its own driver Benoldi. That might seem obvious, but earlier in the year this had caused a big problem between Red Bull and Sauber. Red Bull was a majority shareholder in Sauber at the time, so this was a big rift. And Peter Sauber said the disagreement over driver choice exploded on the eve of the season. At that point in Australia, he said, Red Bull is a majority shareholder, but I have the majority of the votes. I understand they wanted to have their say, but only one person can run the team. Coming back to the summer of 2001, he said, They told me that as far as the driver lineup goes, I made the correct choice. The differences of opinion between us weren't just about whether I take Kimi or Benaldi. At that point, Red Bull's future with Sauber was unclear, but over the following off-season, Red Bull sold its stake, which was the beginning really of its gradual path towards buying Jaguar and having its own team by 2005. Mark, just looking at Benaldi, he really was the first Helmut Marko proper Red Bull junior, and they did get him into F1 in 2001 with arrows. Do you think Benaldi got a fair crack at F1?
Yeah, I think he did. He was probably a little bit unfortunate in his timing in that he arrived in F1 at the same time as Kimi, Alonso, Montoya. So I don't think he was of the caliber of those guys, but he was quick. He deserved a chance in F1, and he got one. And I think it was fair enough. He didn't do anything in there where he transcended the car that made him irresistible to, a top team in the way that Kimi or Fernando did that year. So yeah, I think that's just the way of it. You often hear from people, it's a shame this guy was never given a chance in a top car, but there's usually reasons why that happens, and there's usually reasons why the guys that are recruited to the top teams are those guys and not other guys. There are very, very few outstanding drivers of that level where when engineers look, and people like Jacky look into the actual texture of their lap by lap and their long run pace and their feedback and the way they come back from setbacks, all those things, it marks the outstanding ones out, and there aren't many of them, and so they usually end up in the right places.
Now, it was at the Belgian Grand Prix at the start of September that Sauber confirmed McLaren had made an approach for Raikkonen. Peter said, 2 top teams want him. I prefer not to let him go, but it depends on what and how much I am offered. If he will go, I will have made a good deal. Ferrari was rumoured to be the other team chasing Raikkonen, but Luca Di Montezemolo said, I would never put a young driver in such an important car. It's not the right moment for us because we have Michael Schumacher. The McLaren deal was announced 2 weeks later at the Italian Grand Prix, with Häkkinen taking a sabbatical and Raikkonen taking his place for 2002. And this was pretty much bang on a year from that first test with Sauber in 2000. Sauber said Raikkonen and his management came to him after the German Grand Prix, and he said, for Kimi, it was an absolute must go in this direction. My first reaction was absolutely no way, but then after some discussions with him, I realised it was not possible to keep him because his focus was so strong. Jacky, did you talk to Kimi much about his desire to go to McLaren?
Yeah, we had a chat about that a few times, yeah, for sure, because he was always 100% open and honest with me, and I understood him. He told me his motivation, and he said, yeah, I mean, even if you build a good car at Sauber for 2002, you will never reach the same level than the McLaren Mercedes car, which is a bit true, because also in those days, we had the Ferrari engine, but the customer Ferrari engine was actually the engine from the year before. So we were always lacking 30, 40 horsepower to the red cars, while McLaren was the only team, I think, who had Mercedes engines in those days. So he was like a works team, basically. It was nearly like Mercedes itself, And so I understand him. He said, I want to drive the most competitive car I can get in my hands. So I understand 100%. So I will speak to because he said, yeah, Peter doesn't want to let me go. And I'll speak to him, so I understand you. And yeah, so I knew it would be happening. And I went with Peter to, we took our team plane one day to Stuttgart, because Mercedes has offices on the airport of Stuttgart, and in one of those offices we met the current boss of Mercedes and a few other people, and that's where it was discussed that at the end he would leave us. But I think Peter made a very good deal out of it. I don't think so, I know.
Let's quickly talk about Sauber's other driver, Heidfeld, because he was already under contract to McLaren at the time it signed Raikkonen. Ron Dennis was asked about this, and he said, "We will use the best drivers available to us. It may be a difficult decision, but we'll take them. Nick has more than a chance of driving for us in the future. We have several drivers contracted to this team. It's a very nice problem to have." A couple of years later, Heidfeld was asked about McLaren's decision, and he said although he knew it was coming, "I still don't understand why they went for him over me." He also said, "I tried to do my talking on the track, but looking back on my career, I think I should have been a bit more offensive, maybe made more noise, but it's simply not me. Maybe it would have helped, but it's not my character." And I should say that I think by offensive there, he means on the offensive rather than going around offending people. Mark, was Heidfeld unfortunate to miss out here, given his links to McLaren? And do you think he had a point that over the course of his career, he maybe wasn't pushy enough off track to advance his career in the way that he could have?
But being a top driver and being a top competitor it's a complicated mix, and the personality comes into it. And Kimi, for all that he doesn't say very many words, he's still a very strong, pushy character in terms of pursuing the goal. And so that's all part of the makeup. But also, Heidfeld was a very high level driver, but I don't think he was just of that special quality that Kimi was. And I think if you're in Ron's position at the time, where his existing drivers, Hakkinen and Coulthard, were sort of probably coming to the end of Hakkinen was coming to the end. He'd already informed Ron that he was stopping. So you would be looking at Kimi as your potential Mika replacement. And I don't think Nick was ever perceived in quite that light, and I don't think he would have been really ready to lead a top team in the way that Kimi was. It was just water off duck's back to Kimi. Heidfeld would have been a great replacement if Ron had wanted to replace DC at that time.
Jacky, did you feel any sympathy for Nick when it was Kimi that got signed for 2002?
Yeah, for sure. He was extremely frustrated by this decision, because he thought he was the next who would go to McLaren as a race driver. But on the other hand, you must know McLaren could evaluate Nick extremely well, because his Formula One experience in terms of mileage was extremely high. Because in 98, Formula One went to narrow track and groove tires, which means that the teams who could afford it, like McLaren, already made a car with narrow track in 97 with groove tires. And their test driver was mainly Nick Heidfeld. So he did, in those days, testing was unrestricted, engines were unrestricted. He maybe did 20,000 or 30,000 kilometers already with his narrow track car with the groove tires in 97. He was test driver for them in 98, in 99. So they knew him extremely well. And I think they've also seen that Kimi was a bit outstanding, to him. And actually, knowing all the experience of Nick was not only 1 year of racing with the Prost Grand Prix car, but all these years before, and then seeing what is Kimi doing after 4 races, beating him already in qualifying and in the race. So I think the choice of Ron was quite obvious. I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Ron and Kimi particularly looked back from that moment in the years that followed. Now, Jacky, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and to tell us what it was like working with Raikkonen and bringing him into Formula One. It's an incredible story, one that we very rarely see repeated. And we really appreciate it that you took the time to come and share your stories.
Also, one thing I want to tell you also about Kimi, to see how special he was. In 2001, so his first season, we went to the Monaco Grand Prix. And obviously, he never raced in Monaco, because he had never done GP2 or Formula 3 or whatever, Formula Renault 3.5. So the track was completely new to him. And of course, we only could learn the track by walking a bit. And I took him on the back of my scooter, but between the cars, and it's very difficult to see how the track goes. And in the race, after a number of laps, not a lot, 3, 4, 5, 6, I can't remember exactly, he called me on the radio. He said, "I have no power anymore." Okay, so can you come back to the garage? Yeah. So he came back into the garage. The engine was misfiring. He came out of the car because the race was over, basically. We looked in the data and we saw it was basically a faulty wheel speed sensor because from 2001, traction control was allowed again in F1. Before not, but yes. And so because of faulty wheel speed sensor, the software was thinking that the wheel was spinning all the time, and so it cut down the engine power. So I said to Kimi, so listen, we found the problem. So if you want, I can disconnect or disable the traction control. There is still like nearly 50 laps to go. So you jump in the car, it's experience for next year, for the future of your career. See, but it's Monaco with 900 horsepower, no traction control. See, be careful. So he said, okay, I'll do. So when he went out again, I think there's still 45 laps to go. So he finished the race. Of course, he was last. But without traction control in Monaco, he did the 7th fastest race lap time. That's quite impressive, I must say. You know?
Yeah. Did you disable it for any more races that year?
No. Yeah. No, but I mean, he took my proposition to say, okay, you can have another 45 or 50 laps to go, just for your own proper experience. You know, what you learn this year, maybe you can use next year. You need a better car to win the race. You never know. And so he did it, and he did it really very, very well. I mean, he knew he would have 0 points, of course. It happens sometimes in Monaco that there are only 3 cars finishing, like in '96, but that's exceptional. But you know, it was no lack of motivation. You know, some other guy would have said, "Well, why? No, it doesn't matter." And for him, it was like an opportunity to learn more. So he jumped in the car and he drove flat out, you know, at 2-3 millimeters from the barriers all the time, no mistakes. 7th fastest race lap time, no traction control.
There was also it's a story. I don't know if you can tell us here about when he turned up for the test at Magny-Cours and he wasn't in the best state. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, I don't know too much about it, but it happens sometimes. Yes. Yeah, it is for sure. Sometimes he likes to have a drink, you know.
Was he still quick the next morning?
Well, yeah, I mean, it happened also. The last race I did with Kimi in F1 2001 was Suzuka, you know. And of course, like all the other tracks, Suzuka was also new to him, and most of the other tracks. And you have this very fast corner there, the R130 bend, which is flat in an F1 car. So I told him that easy, flat, and so on, but be careful anyway because the speed is very high. It's a bit of bumps, you know. And I said, okay. So in the first free practice on Friday morning, he was lifting quite a lot, you know, in that corner. And of course, because he was flat, but it was still a high G corner. It was flat, but not easy flat. And so I told him, comparing to your teammate Nick in the garage here, I mean, he's easy flat to the corner, and you're still lifting quite a lot. I told her in the radio. And then he made a sign to me to come closer to him. So he wanted to speak me, not in the radio. And I listened to yourself and said, what do you want to tell me? He will be flat in free practice too, but my head is still hurting. Okay. But I must say, this happened not a lot. Yeah?
Massive thank you to Jacky for offering so much first-hand insight there about Raikkonen's first season in F1. But Mark, let's tie up a few loose ends before we go. Firstly, on Heidfeld, it's worth adding that in 2020, when he was interviewed for F1's Beyond the Grid podcast, he did say McLaren did a good choice by going for Raikkonen, as proven by Kimi's subsequent career. Nick said he was disappointed, but it wasn't the biggest drama in the world, so it's not like it's something he still dwells on today. But let's go back to Ferrari, because when Raikkonen's McLaren deal was announced, Ron Dennis said that another offer was on the table, which was to stay at Sauber for one more year, then to move on to a team where he would be a number 2 driver. The thought of that was very unattractive to him because he did not want to be a number 2. At McLaren, we have a policy of not having a number 1 and a number 2 driver, and Kimi liked that. And it's widely acknowledged that the deal Ron was talking about there was from Ferrari. Mark, do you think Raikkonen made the right choice to take McLaren's offer over what was on the table from Maranello at that time?
Absolutely, yes. You can't go in there as at that stage of your career as a support driver. Not if you have aspirations to fight for championships. And it's a different situation to that somebody like Eddie Irvine or Rubens Barrichello took, which they're already had a reasonable career up to that point, and this was really sort of the cashing in of that. And but not for Kimi and the impact, the level of impact that he made, it was essential that he kept that momentum. The momentum of the perception's everything, and you have to keep that. If you've got it, you've got to keep that momentum going. And turning up, doing another season in a Sauber, and then turning up at Ferrari as a support to Michael wouldn't really have maintained that momentum. So yeah, I think he did absolutely the right thing.
Yeah, he certainly wouldn't have got to fight Michael for the 2003 World Championship as he did at McLaren. Now, as well as Heidfeld, there was another driver contracted to McLaren already who not only thought he was in with a shot, but was briefly told the drive was his for 2002. And we're talking about McLaren's main test driver at the time, Alex Wurz. Wurz told the McLaren website in 2016 that he was called into the pits while testing at Monza to take a phone call from Martin Whitmarsh, who told him, "Congratulations, I thought I'd interrupt the test because you'll race for us next year." Wurz said he didn't know at the time that Dennis was chasing Raikkonen, and when he didn't get any follow-ups after that phone call from Whitmarsh, Alex says he realised there was something brewing. He flew to the UK to see Ron, who told him, "Actually, we are signing Kimi." Wurz said, "I was grown up enough to realise that they did not do it to hurt me. They did it because they thought it was the better option for the team," which, to be fair, it probably was. Even if Alex has taken it like a grown-up, as he said there, Mark, was this still handled slightly clumsily by McLaren?
It was, yes, and it's a little bit of a function of the management structure there, and the two personalities involved in that was getting a little bit tetchy, and there were different sort of agendas going on there. So it's quite a I wouldn't say trouble, but it was certainly turbulent at McLaren at the management level at that time. So I think this was just a function of that, really, and it just sort of seeped out in an unfortunate way. But yeah, as Alex said, they ultimately made the right decision.
I should say that we'll talk about Häkkinen's decision to leave F1, which sparked this Raikkonen move. And the whole, was it a sabbatical or was it retirement? We'll do an episode on that in the future, so we can really do it justice rather than a fleeting mention here. So the final point we'll cover in this episode is to pick up on a line from Michael Schumacher. In the summer of 2001, he said Raikkonen was the best of that year's rookies, which, given the names Mark listed earlier of the rookie crop for 2001, was quite a big statement when you consider that you had Juan Pablo Montoya at Williams and Fernando Alonso making waves at Minardi. Mark, you've covered all of those drivers throughout their career, their highs and lows, and obviously we're getting Fernando back this year in 2021. But back then, what do you make of Schumacher's declaration about the rookie crop at the time and the fact that in his eyes, Kimi was the standout talent?
He might have been. I wasn't convinced. I thought it might have been Alonso as well. But the problem with trying to compare them in that season was that the Minardi was as far off a Sauber as a Sauber was off a Ferrari. So probably a Sauber would be a thick end of 2 seconds slower than a Ferrari, and a Minardi was thick end of 4 seconds slower. So really, it's a sort of bit like George Williams's. A bit like George Russell's season at Williams in 2019, where the car is just not just at the back; it's hanging off the back. It's not even can't even fight the cars ahead of it, which Alonso occasionally did. He could occasionally put it ahead of an Arrows or a Prost or something like that, and you could do something extraordinary with it. So I wasn't. Although Kimi was absolutely outstanding, as we've just discussed, I thought Alonso was doing some extraordinary things as well. So I wasn't as adamant. I couldn't have got behind Michael's declaration that it was definitely Kimi. And Montoya did obviously some great things as well, but he was coming in from Champ Car. He probably more experienced than those two guys. And his peaks were extraordinary, but he also had quite some troughs as well. So for me, the rookie of the year was between Kimi and Fernando.
Yeah, and we've discussed Montoya's 2001 season as well in the past, and based on what we went over there, I wouldn't be surprised if Michael's line was partly a dig at Montoya, who was already a thorn in his side. But we'll leave it there for Kimi Raikkonen's F1 arrival. It was quite the journey from that first Mugello test to being announced as a McLaren driver exactly a year later. Thanks again to Jacky for joining us, and of course to Mark, who will be on one of our season finale episodes where we'll answer your questions about F1's V10 era from 1989 to 2005. Make sure you get your questions in using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter, or if you think we deserve it, you can leave us a 5-star podcast review and submit a question there as well. Next time, we're switching from the beginning of one legendary name in F1 to the end of another. We're taking a trip back to 1994 and revisiting the demise of Lotus and the end of a once great team's slow and painful fall into F1 obscurity.